When you're growing tomatoes, there are so many decisions that have to be made that will determine the overall success of your plants. And one of those decisions is to prune or not to prune. If you happen to prune the wrong part of your plant, you could potentially end up with no fruit, which would be horrible. And so in today's video, we're gonna go over which types of tomato plants to prune, the tomato plants that you should never prune, how and when to do it. Plus, at the very end of the video, I will be covering a planting technique that will allow you to let your tomato plants grow wild and not prune at all. So to start off, you first need to know which types of tomato plants you're growing, because there are two different types of tomato plants, and that is indeterminate tomato plant varieties and determinate tomato plant varieties. There's also semi-determinate and there's dwarf varieties, but for the sake of this video, you really just need to know whether your plant is an indeterminate variety or a determinate variety. And the difference between the two is based on how the plants grow. So indeterminate tomato varieties, for example, a Better Boy and an Early Girl, and almost all heirloom varieties are indeterminate. They continue growing until they get killed off by a frost. And they produce fruit all throughout the season, and they can get huge. They can grow beyond 10 feet tall if you stake them that way. They're just huge productive plants. And then on the other side, there is determinate varieties, which grow to a determined height and width, and they pretty much produce all of their fruit at once, so it can all be harvested pretty much at the same time or pretty close within the same time frame. And they don't get as big, and you do not want to prune those types. An example of a determinate variety would be a Roma tomato. They're more like a bush type tomato. They grow closer to the ground. They're better if you have a small space, but the one thing is that they're going to produce fruit all at once and pretty much just have one big harvest. They're not going to give you fruit all season long. So I like to always have a variety of both. I like determinate varieties for canning because you'll get one huge harvest all at once, but I love having my indeterminate tomatoes so that I can pick fresh tomatoes all season long. And so if you have indeterminate varieties out in your garden, those are the types that you do want to prune. You don't have to prune, but there's benefits to pruning. And so the very first thing to know is which type of tomato you're growing. And if you don't know, then I suggest not pruning at all, because you don't want to ruin the overall yield of your plants. If you prune determinate varieties, you're gonna potentially cut off growth that would produce more fruit, and you already don't have that much fruit from that plant, so you don't want to trim anything off. So if you're not sure, don't prune. If you do know which types of tomatoes you're growing, then it's really beneficial to prune accordingly. So I'm gonna go over showing you how to prune on a few different plants, because I have some plants that are small right now, others that have grown quite a bit bigger, and a few that are like the perfect size that can show you all the parts to better help you understand the process of pruning. So let's start with one that is pretty clear to see, and I feel like it's a great one to start with to show you all the parts of the plant so that you can understand which parts to prune and which not to prune. So to start, this is a plant that has not been pruned yet. I've just planted it and let it be. And this is what it's going to grow like if you don't do anything. It has all these lower branches, and you really don't want the leaves and the branches touching the soil, because it's going to make your plant more susceptible to disease. So everything, on no matter what tomato plant you have, everything from about the foot mark, which these plants aren't that tall yet, so it's about 8 inches up, but everything from this point below, you could easily trim off and you're not going to have any issues. You're just going to make your plant healthier so that it's not susceptible to disease. So if you look right over here, I just pruned up this one, and it's way cleaner. You know, it has no lower branches, so I trimmed off everything from here down. And now we're going to identify each part of the tomato plant. So the first thing you need to identify is the main stem. And so the main stem is this, and you can follow it all the way up the plant to the top. And the second thing you need to identify is all of the suckers, and that's the parts of the plant that we can prune. And a sucker is in the axis of the tomato plant, and the axis is the junction between the main stem and a true leaf. So you could see right here, if I could get close enough, you could see this little thing growing in this junction. So we have the main stem right here, and this main true leaf. This right here, if I zoom out a little bit, is another true leaf. And right here, this would be a sucker growing in the junction between the main stem and the true leaf. So right here we have a little tiny sucker, and you can just pull that off with your thumb and index finger. However, this one has gotten to be pretty big already, and so I'm actually going to leave it on this plant, and I will explain why in just a little bit. But if you wanted to trim this one off, you could, and I would use sharp, clean shears and trim that off. And then if we follow our way up the plant, you can see right here is another sucker. So this is the main stem, this is a true leaf, and right in the junction is another sucker. And then the most important part of the plant is where the flowers form, which are the fruit clusters. And you can see right here, it's its own branch, and that's what forms the flowers and the fruit. So you definitely don't ever want to trim those off. So depending on how much space you have is going to determine how many suckers you want to leave on your tomato plants. The more suckers you leave gives you the possibility of having more fruit, which is great. However, if you don't have as much space, you want to keep your plants more cleaned up so that they're smaller and they can be closer together without the risk for disease and plant issues. However, out here where I am, I have this large space, and so I'm choosing to leave more suckers on these plants so that they can develop into potentially more fruit for the plant, because I have the space, and these tomato plants are spaced far apart. I have them about 4 feet or more apart out here. But when I get over to my tomatoes in my raised beds, they're a lot closer together, and so I'm going to be more picky, and I'm going to prune more so the plants stay a little bit smaller and more cleaned up. So one quick thing that I wanted to point out to you that I just noticed for myself is what a difference I'm having with my tomatoes in my raised beds versus straight in the ground. So typically I always plant my tomatoes right here where I'm standing. You can see I have these really long rows, and I have plenty of space to grow tomatoes, and they can kind of just grow wild. This year we are being very intentional about pruning because I want to try to keep them a little bit more in control. However, I have tomatoes that are right outside our front door in an Olive Garden's raised bed. And I have 2 of them. I am really loving them. It's the first year I've planted anything in raised beds right near our house. Usually I just have everything out here in this garden. You can kind of see a quick little look around. Anyways, the tomatoes in my raised beds are really growing so much better than out here in the ground. Obviously, I had fresh new potting soil and soil amendments that I mixed together. So they have a really good mixture of soil that has never been planted in before. So it's full of nutrients for the plants, but I'm just really amazed at the difference in size. So I'm going to show you the size difference. These plants were planted on the same exact day. However, the ones in the raised beds are doing 10 times better. So this here is a Better Boy tomato that is planted directly in the ground out in the garden, and it's growing pretty good, but it's still pretty small. And then I'm going to compare it to the one that's in the raised garden bed. And then this here is a Better Boy from the same batch of tomatoes that was planted on the same exact day, but it's just growing here in my Olive Garden's raised bed and growing so much better. You can see pretty much everything is really growing well in here. This tomato is really taking off, but they're just much bigger than the ones that are planted out in the ground. Okay, so as you're pruning your tomato plants, here are a few important tips to remember. Each sucker will produce more flowers, which means more fruit, but you don't want to keep all the suckers on the plant. You want to keep a few so that you can have more fruit, but you don't want to keep too many or your plant's quickly going to get out of control. Each sucker can produce a sucker, which can produce another sucker. And you can see how quickly that would get out of control. And that's how plants get huge and crazy and wild and all over the place. So you want to keep them neat. And so trim some suckers, but not all of them. The other thing to keep in mind is that once you prune for the first time, you don't have to go crazy the first time. You can come back in a few weeks and prune again. In fact, it's actually a better practice to prune the first time when your plants are just big enough and starting to set some fruit so that you could see everything clearly, and then come back out in a few weeks and prune again, and possibly even a few more times throughout the summer. So by now, I'm sure that you can agree that pruning your tomatoes is pretty beneficial. However, I will be honest to say that I have not been very good about it in the past. I sometimes prune off the bottom branches to get them up off the soil, but beyond that, I haven't really done much in the past. And I will say my tomatoes have grown huge, had tons of tomatoes, and have done pretty well for no pruning. And sometimes it's kind of nice to just let them grow and produce as much fruit as they possibly can and not pay that much attention to them. I have a lot of space, as you can see right here behind me. And when I plant my tomatoes, I tend to just plant them and kind of let them go. But this year I want to be more intentional about it because I want things just cleaned up. I I can't handle when things are totally out of control because it gets a little bit overwhelming for me, and so I don't love to let them go out of control, but that is what I typically do. They just have plenty of space and I let them grow wild. But there is a few reasons why you obviously don't want to do this, and that's because you're going to have more issues with pests and disease. And if you're limited on space, it's not really a great idea. If you prune your tomatoes and you only let them have 1 to 2 main stems, you can plant tomatoes a lot closer together and still have great success. But if you do want to plant them and just let them grow wild and produce tons of fruit all throughout the season and just not worry about touching them, then you're going to need lots more space. And I've had great success by planting my tomato plants really spaced out and letting them grow wild. But there's a way to do it. And so if you head to this next video, I talk all about spacing your tomato plants and how far apart to plant them. And this truly applies to you if you don't want to prune and you just want to plant your tomatoes and go wild. So head to that video there, check out my important tips about spacing your tomato plants properly, and I will see you there.